Today on the channel, I have a very special guest. Every time I have a guest, they are special to me. This one is especially special. He's actually local to my area. We tried to get together in person, didn't quite work out. His name is Pastor Baruch Maoz. He has pastored in Israel and is a fluent speaker not only of English, as you'll see, but of modern Hebrew. And Baruch, who insisted that I must call him Baruch and not Pastor Maoz, and I'll do my best, Baruch has translated the Hebrew Bible into modern Hebrew. Pastor Maoz, thank you so much for coming on the channel today.
I'm delighted to be with you, Mark. Thank you.
So, Pastor Maoz, how have you served the body of Christ over time? Then we'll get to that Bible translation, which is the main discussion point for today.
Well, I had the awesome privilege of pastoring a local Christian congregation in Israel for some 33 years. In addition to that, I've been involved in the production of Christian literature, both translating and writing Christian literature in Hebrew.
Wonderful. And when did you come over to the United States?
March 2020, just before COVID hit.
Oh my, wow. Well, that was quite the welcome to the U.S. for you. And I met you now about a year ago at the family camp that your church was holding. Your church is about 45 minutes to an hour south of me, and my friend Nick Alford is the pastor of that church. And I remember having some enlightening discussions with you about Hebrew, about modern Hebrew, about Messianic Judaism. Right at that time, I was writing an article. Your points were very helpful, and I was fascinated to find out that you had translated the Hebrew Bible into modern Hebrew. But tell me this, why would you translate the Hebrew Bible into Hebrew?
Well, for the same reason that one would translate Beowulf into modern English. Modern Hebrew is very different from biblical Hebrew, although it is largely based on biblical Hebrew.
I've actually read more than one book about its history, and I find it to be incredibly romantic and theologically significant. I'm not aware of a single other instance in the history of mankind in which a whole nation has recovered its language, its spoken language, and taught it to, immigrants coming in. It's really remarkable. And yet, like all languages, it has undergone change, not only because modern Hebrew needs words that biblical Hebrew didn't, like computer, but because languages all change naturally. So let me ask you this, when did you learn modern Hebrew?
I was born here in the States, in Boston, Massachusetts. Immigrated to Israel as a child in 1953, where, like everyone else, I had to learn the language. And so I've been speaking Hebrew since 1953.
And how old were you at that point, if you don't mind my asking?
I don't mind at all. I was somewhere between 10 to 11 years old.
Okay. So you were still at the age where learning to speak fluently without an accent was possible, yes?
Barely. When I'm tired, people can still detect something of an American accent in my Hebrew.
And you were schooled in modern Hebrew? That is, you went through literature courses and grammar courses and had to diagram sentences and all of that?
Correct.
Your ability to read biblical Hebrew, where does that come from in your life history?
Simply by reading the Bible. There was nothing else available except either an English translation or the Hebrew original. And so I was forced to learn the Hebrew original.
Interesting. When you first picked up the Hebrew Bible, biblical Hebrew, how old were you at that time?
I was converted while doing my mandatory military service in 1963. I was just over the age of 20.
Okay. And when, as a modern Hebrew speaker, though when tired you have an American accent, when you picked up biblical Hebrew, about how much of it did you feel you understood?
Well, I thought I understood a lot more than I actually did. Words have changed their meaning, and of course syntax has been altered significantly. So I'm not sure I could judge. Over the course of time, I discovered that many of my understandings were misunderstandings.
So that's exactly why we're talking now, although I didn't coach you on saying that. I expected that to be the case, given what I know about language. I've been to Israel. I do not speak modern Hebrew. I struggle with unpointed Hebrew, especially. I can kind of piece together what signs are saying often, but when it comes to reading full sentences, I certainly couldn't do it. And yet, because I know language, I expected there to be dead words and false friends between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew. So let's talk about some examples. What are some words that existed in biblical Hebrew but are no longer used in modern Hebrew? They are dead words. Could you give us maybe 2 examples?
Well, I could think of one off my head, and that is a word that appears in Ezekiel chapter 1, where he describes the manifestation of the glory of God, and he uses a word that is often translated like a bolt of lightning or a shining, depending on the translation. The Hebrew word is the word chashmal. When Hebrew was resurrected, no one knew what that word means, because it is a word that is never used elsewhere. And therefore, it was set aside and then used to a modern term, electricity.
Okay. So actually, that would be a false friend, right? Because when someone who speaks modern Hebrew reads that word in Ezekiel, they think suddenly they recognize it, and they don't realize their misunderstanding. Would people, I suppose, however, if they see electricity from ancient times, maybe they would be confused. Help me understand, what would modern readers get out of that passage?
Nothing, unless they knew something of the background. They wouldn't get anything. They'd have the kind of same sense that Ben Yehuda had when he used this word to describe electricity. It certainly had to do with something like shining or glory or lightning or something like that. But he couldn't go any further.
Okay. So interesting. And since I don't have a grasp of modern Hebrew, I may be struggling to know whether it counts as a dead word or a false friend. Let's go to another example. Maybe we can find a little clearer one. What are another word maybe that is dead, no longer used in modern Hebrew?
There are no dead words in biblical Hebrew, simply because any words like the word I just gave an example of, chashmal, these were set aside and then used for other purposes. So there are fundamentally no dead words in biblical Hebrew.
Okay, now you're the expert and I certainly am not. I wonder, the book of Job, that is sort of infamous for having a lot of hapax legomena, words that appear only once, or very difficult words, obscure words, the kinds of words that the King James translators talked about in their preface, where they said that even the Jews don't know what they mean and they just write down something to write something, not because they're confident of what they say. Are there no words, even obscure ones, in Job, for example, that are just dropped completely out of the language? Or did Ben Yehuda and others who resurrected modern Hebrew into its current form, did they have to use everything in the Bible?
To the best of my knowledge, that is exactly what Ben Yehuda did. He created a store of words that would be dead, and then he gave them new life by using them for other purposes. Now, I have been mistaken before. Don't tell my wife. I could be mistaken on this point, but I believe that is the case.
Very, very fascinating. So, someone who has certainly greater knowledge of this than I do by far is saying that the category of dead words doesn't really apply between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew, but then the category of false friends has to be extensive, I would think. So can you give us some more examples then, if you would, of misunderstandings that are caused to modern Hebrew speakers by their by language change when they read biblical Hebrew?
Well, let me take a simple example from Genesis 15:9, where a ram, each 3 years old, is spoken of, and the Hebrew would be literally translated as a ram in the shape of a triangle. Or to take another example, in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 5, David says to Jonathan, again, the English would say, tomorrow is the new moon. In Hebrew, it simply says, tomorrow is the month.
Okay. And somebody who's reading along in modern Hebrew, they're not going to realize their misunderstanding, yes or no, in those places?
Well, when it comes to these two examples, obviously there's no such thing as a triangular ram. And
So they'll realize their misunderstanding.
He would realize he's not understanding. That is correct.
But in the second one, maybe they wouldn't realize it.
They might not realize what he means by tomorrow is a month, the month, a month. What does it mean? Or to take maybe an example where a modern reader may think that he's understanding and he doesn't, would be Genesis chapter 4, verse 21, where the translation in English would be string instruments and pipes. But the Hebrew refers to kinor ve'ugav. A kinor is the word that is used today to describe a violin, and an ugav is the Hebrew word used to describe an organ. Neither of these existed in those days.
And so modern readers, when they encounter that, what are they getting out of it? What do they understand it to mean?
They wouldn't be able to understand.
Okay. They recognize the words, but they would have a really hard time making sense of what the sentence is saying, in other words.
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. So fascinating. Now, I have several viewers who are not Christians on my channel, and one of them is, as best I can recall, she's an atheist. She's, ethnically Jewish, as my wife is, for what it's worth. I think I might have told you that. She's Jewish and Greek. But this woman who has taken a real interest in my channel heard I was going to interview you, and she loaded me up with questions. I couldn't possibly ask you them all, but one that she asked was about Zarephath, which is, as I understand, the woman of Zarephath. That's the way we tend to translate that into contemporary English and biblical Hebrew. But she said Zarephath is now the name of France. Is that true? And then I have another question about that.
That is absolutely correct.
So when you come along, here's my question, to translate this passage about the woman of Zarephath into modern Hebrew, what do you do? Do you use Zarephath and then put a footnote, or do you make a new transliteration or something? What do you do?
Well, I can't recall what we did exactly. I have my translations here, and if you gave me the reference, I could look it up. But
let's do that.
Let me just say one thing about our translation. We originally considered translating the Bible into modern spoken English per se, and decided that that would be unwise because it would not be acceptable to the general populace. And therefore, what we did is we chose to translate it into limited vocabulary Hebrew geared at the youth. And our translation, while it is word for word, verse for verse, chapter per chapter, it is at a lower level of Hebrew, premeditatedly, so that it would not be used by the general believing community in lieu of the Hebrew Bible.
Interesting. Yeah, because you have a very specific situation that can only exist in places that speak Hebrew and places that speak Greek. I suppose Aramaic, maybe you could count that. But it's one thing to replace the King James Version, as I advocate on this channel, in institutional settings, because it itself is already a translation. But to replace what's inspired and within possible reach of the believing community with a translation, that would require, well, help me think through that. At what point would you say, the biblical Hebrew is so inaccessible to the believing community that we're going to have to make a translation of it into modern Hebrew? How would you know when that time has come?
That is a good question. we knew that the time came because we knew that the average Hebrew speaker in Israel did not understand biblical Hebrew. Not only are the conjugations different, but biblical Hebrew does not actually have tenses, whereas modern Hebrew does. And that immediately creates a problem for the average reader. And that is why you will find various translations will take particularly prophetic passages. Some of them project them into the present or the future. Some project them into the past.
This is very fascinating. It really makes me wonder, and I'm just having to rely on your extensive knowledge here because I'm so limited in this knowledge. What do regular people, and I apologize for any noises in the background, viewers out there. I'm in a coffee shop, and today people have decided to go in and out, and large trucks have decided to drive by. Anyway, I don't have an office right now, and so I'm kind of stuck. The believing community, what did they do then? I mean, that's a massive difference. There's no tense. How has the believing community gotten along reading the Old Testament? If when such a big difference exists?
Either by using our translation meant for youth and children, or by reading translation in other languages. My wife, for example, who is Israeli born, prefers her English Bible.
Very interesting. That is actually what I would have guessed, because I'm aware that it's Americans mainly in the world who are, who assume that everybody else is monolingual, but in other nations, that's not the assumption. And isn't that indeed the case that many Israelis are at least bilingual?
At the very least. And our church, I'd be preaching in Hebrew, and there would be translation into 3 or 4 or 5 languages at the same time.
Wow, that is fascinating. So it's a very different linguistic situation than we face here in the U.S. And yet, here's this parallel, at least when it comes to the King James Version, that language change causes problems for understanding. The difference is that the King James is a translation and the Hebrew Bible is not. Let me ask you another question I did not prep you for, so I'm sorry if it takes us a little time. You know what? We need to get back to Zarephath. I did find the verse. Could we try 1 Kings 17, 8, 9, and 10? The word Zarephath appears in that passage.
1 Kings
17, 8 to 10. How did you handle that one?
17, 8 to 10, where we are. We use the term Zarephath, and then no, we didn't even footnote it. We just used the word Zarephath.
Okay, interesting.
You see, our purpose was not to write a commentary, but simply to translate.
Right. And yes, it's possible that people will come away thinking the woman of France, is interacting with Elijah, I believe, in that passage. But hopefully they'll realize if they've gotten that far into the Old Testament that that doesn't make any sense, and they'll look for some other solution. I suppose there is no longer a Zarephath in Israel,
There is not.
Okay, so interesting. Yeah, what a fascinating challenge. Now, there's one question I didn't ask you. I've got so many questions. When you talk about the we who created this modern Hebrew translation of the Bible, who's the we? Who did this with you?
I was heading up a publishing house called Hagefen Publishing House, The Vine, and I had a team. And here's my opportunity to make some correction to how I was described. I initiated the translation of the Old Testament, supervised it and edited it, but hired someone who actually did the translation, and then she and I would go through it word for word. We then presented the results of our work to a number of control groups. Some were experts in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew. Some were experts in biblical Hebrew, and some were simply children whom we wanted to make sure that they would tell us if they understood what we were writing. And that is the we.
Excellent.
The New Testament I translated, and my translator of the Old Testament edited me.
Okay. That was my other question. Did you translate the entire Bible? Because I have seen a translation of the New Testament into Hebrew before. It's passed around by an organization in the U.S. for the evangelization of Jews. And I didn't get the impression that this is what you're talking about. So isn't there at least one other translation of the New Testament into Hebrew?
There are a number. There was one that was done in the early part of the 20th century by a scholar by the name of Zalkinson. He took a direction. Hebrew at that time was not quite a spoken language. And he took a direction contrary to the direction that the Hebrew language has developed. Another translation was done by Delitzsch of fame.
That's the one I've seen.
And he based his translation on the Mishnah, a Mishnaic Hebrew. Mishnaic Hebrew is a Hebrew that was developed following the destruction of the Second Temple. There is a third translation that is a modern Hebrew translation used by the churches in Israel more than any other translation. That was done by the United Bible Societies and is based on what is known as the dynamic equivalent.
Okay. So in your church, when you pastored for 33 years, what Bible translations into Hebrew would people be holding?
Any one of the two latter.
Okay. And just so fascinating. So many questions. There is one a thread I want to pick up, but something I'm not going to forget. But let's keep going down that thread. How well was your translation received? Did people understand what you were trying to do?
Yes. You will not find a Christian home in Israel that does not have our translation.
Excellent. So they're able to use this alongside of other New Testament translations they have, and alongside of other translations into English or French or Russian or whatever they happen to speak, as one of many tools for understanding God's Word. Would that be correct?
That is correct. The Old Testament and select portions of the New Testament are taught in Israeli schools as part of the core curriculum.
Wow.
We endeavored to introduce our translation into the educational system. It was rejected because it came from a Christian source. But
right.
Teachers have accessed our translation and surreptitiously recommended to their students to use it so as to understand the biblical text. It is also available online.
So Jewish believers, rabbis, the Orthodox that we read about in the news, especially right now during the Israel-Hamas war, would they not have some interest in creating maybe what they might consider a paraphrase of the Hebrew Bible into modern Hebrew? Why haven't Jewish people themselves done this, or have they?
For the same reason that the Roman Catholic Church opposed translation of the Vulgate. They believe that the text is sacred as it is, not only in its meaning, but in its very letters and the arrangement of the letters, and therefore it must not be in any way tampered with. So much so that where there are errata in the text, known to be errata, there are annotations given at the bottom, but the errors are not corrected because the text is sacred.
Yeah, that seems to be a universal human tendency. Someone will, a group of people will baptize a certain language, a certain form of their sacred text as inviolable, unchangeable. And I face this even in culture where people hear me talk about wanting to update the King James, especially in institutional settings, and they say, well, you wouldn't update Shakespeare, would you? And it's as if once that man wrote those words down, it no longer matters whether people understand them. They're sacred. And it seems to me that what Protestantism did is say, no, it matters, it's all important that people understand. So I want to say, Pastor Maoz, Baruch, I'm very heartened, I'm encouraged to hear that Christians have adopted your limited vocabulary translation, because I wondered if there is, a version of King James onlyism, as it were, among Christians in Israel, such a small group, although you've told me that it's grown over time. Are there people who just can't stomach Christian people who can't stomach using your translation?
No, I have never heard of anyone who's opposed this project or has refused to make this translation available, at least to the children. Because it is a limited vocabulary, and because we did not want to create a situation in which evangelical Christians, and we evangelicals are notoriously lazy, we did not want evangelical Christians in Israel to use one translation and the rest of the population another, and thereby create a kind of an obstacle, an evangelistic obstacle. Right. And so we created a translation that is not only limited vocabulary, but we produced it in the form of a children's Bible. There are plenty of illustrations. It's hardcover, thick paper, a glossy paper. So no one is going to climb up to the pulpit and preach from it. But as they prepare their sermons, if they have any difficulty understanding the text, they probably won't admit it, but they'll peek into our translation to get a sense of the text.
Oh, I just love that. Wow. The King James translators wrote this preface, and it has had a massive impact on me. I've read it so many times. And they launched their preface with this feeling of massive defensiveness. And they talk about how they're going to receive petty objections. They just know it. And they talk about how they're going to be tossed upon tongues. I'm so grateful that the Lord has not sent that to you, because it sure sounds like the tool that you've created is really essential for the Christian church in that land, that very small but growing Christian church. Okay, I had another question about false friends, and I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot here, but maybe we can wind up our discussion with this. Among the many different misunderstandings that could possibly occur because of language change as contemporary modern Hebrew-speaking Christians read biblical Hebrew, are any of them theologically important, or maybe even just funny, causing weird misunderstandings? What are some sort of classic misunderstandings that are more significant that modern Hebrew speakers might have?
Well, a triangular ram would be quite an interesting view.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can remember where it. Yes, in 2 Kings 4:8, we are told that there was in Shunem. The English translation would be a well-to-do woman. In Hebrew, it's a very large woman. Obviously, these would not be the intention. Well, maybe someone would think that the reference was to her physical size, but obviously not. When it comes to theological, perhaps Isaiah 7:15 comes to mind that might be an example where the English translation would say he'll be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, whereas the Hebrew could be easily translated that he will eat curds and honey so that he may know how to distinguish between right and wrong.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, because function words like that, and I'm pulling up the English Standard Version. I probably need to look at the Hebrew, but they are especially subject to sort of random change like that. And there are examples in English, in 1 Kings 8, the phrase "so that" actually meant "if only" back in 1611, but it certainly doesn't mean that now. Yeah, and on the one hand, it sounds to me, given the examples you've given me, that we're not talking about people massively misunderstanding key passages, but it's like they're walking on an old sidewalk and they keep stumbling and tripping and having to go around obstacles. Whereas if you can just put the text into the language they actually speak, then yes, difficulties would still remain because the Bible contains difficulties, but you would have smoother sailing. You'd be able to walk down the sidewalk. So I'm so grateful for the work that you've done, and in a way I just have to trust, because I can't read it, that the work that you've done is beneficial for Christ Church. But everything you're telling me makes me think you've wisely navigated the situation so well, even the way you formatted the book. And Pastor Maoz, Baruch, thank you so much for doing that work, and thank you so much for popping over to my channel to instruct, I think, some very fascinated viewers who will have just enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's been a privilege to talk with you, and I hope that this will be of some use and some interest to your hearers.
Yes, I'm sure it will be. Now, viewers out there, I've actually struggled to find someone who can talk with me who is comparable to Pastor Maoz when it comes to modern Greek. I've made some forays, tried to reach out to people and not really succeeded. So if you know anyone who you think could have this conversation with me in English, but about modern Greek versus Koine Greek, I'd be very interested in that. Thanks everybody for watching, and join us again next time for whatever is going on next week on the channel.